Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's State of the Nation webinar. I'm really pleased that so many of you have been able to join us again, particularly at lunchtime. I'm Tash, I'm Policy and Research Lead at SotN, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by Luke Young, Assistant Director of Citizen Advice Cymru, to talk about the cost of living crisis and the gendered impacts in Wales. I'll just run through a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Just to say that if you have any issues at all with tech or any sound issues, etc., please do drop a message in the chat. My colleague Thomas is there to support if you can. We will have plenty of time for questions towards the end of today's session, so please do use the Q&A function. As they pop into your head, please pop them in, and Thomas will be putting those questions to myself and Luke as we get toward the end of the session. We will obviously, of course, be sharing stuff on our social media channels. So please do get involved in the conversation. Tag us at SotN. Hashtags are State of the Nation 2023 or hashtag SotN, depending on how many characters you might have left available after you put your content in. As I said, today's session is focused on the cost of living crisis and on the gendered impacts. I'm going to share my screen in just a second and take you through some of the sort of key bits of evidence that we included in our cost of living briefing that we published just before Christmas, a little before Christmas. Luke will then be sharing some reflections from Citizen Advice before we move into questions. So what I will do is do that awkward bit where we're just waiting for this screen share to happen. Fab. So I will make a start. I think it's fair to say, certainly when we were in the process of putting together our cost of living briefing a few months ago, and even now, we're probably not yet seeing the full effect of the cost of living crisis in the data that's available. And some of the data that I'll share today was actually collected before the winter period, where we know that some of the pressures have gotten even worse and have intensified for a lot of families. From the data that is available, though, we can already see that the crisis is impacting women to a disproportionate extent. Research from the Living Wage Foundation found that 42% of low-paid women had already fallen behind on household bills compared to 35% of low-paid men. The Young Women's Trust carried out a survey sort of early autumn last year. They found that 54% of young women were reporting it being a real struggle to make ends meet. That rose to 65% for mums with joint childcare responsibility and to 75% for single mums. The Smallwood Trust had seen an increase in the number of applications to their Grants to Individuals programme, specifically from people looking for support with costs such as rising energy and fuel prices, rent, and other essential items. That same survey by the Living Wage Foundation found that 35% of low-paid women were already skipping meals regularly in order to make ends meet, compared to 29% of low-paid men. It won't be a surprise that this is starting to have an impact on women's health and well-being. 52% of young women reporting being filled with dread when they think about their household finances. And there was evidence that the crisis is being used as a tool of coercive control. Women's Aid in England found that 96% of survivors had seen a negative impact on the amount of money available to them, and 66% said that their abusers were using the cost of living crisis as a tool of coercive control. The disproportionate impact that we're already seeing of the cost of living crisis on women is sadly not surprising. It's rooted in the persistent inequality that women still encounter, inequality that our State of the Nation report that we published yesterday brings into sharp focus. And that's leaving them more vulnerable to the squeeze on incomes as a result of the crisis. And we can see across a range of different metrics how gender inequality is either creating or exacerbating the situation. There's a lot more data in the cost of living briefing that's available on our website, so please do dig into that if you want to get into more detail. But I wanted to just pull out a few of the key facts and figures that I think set the scene for today's discussion. Firstly, women are more likely to be in poverty and face greater risk of falling into poverty. Looking at the latest official poverty stats, these were collected and published before the cost of living crisis really kicked in. It is important to keep that in mind. we see that 23% of people of households in Wales are living in relative income poverty. For lone parents, the majority of whom we know are women, that rises to 46%. We also see that single female households with no children are at a slightly higher risk of being in relative income poverty at 30% compared to 27% of single male households. The graph that I've included on this slide includes the data, the most up-to-date data, the green bars, and data from 2016 to 17, the purple bars. And we see a pretty unchanging picture. Actually, in terms of single parent households, the situation is worsening. A figure that for me sort of really brings some of this into sharp focus is related to the minimum income standard. That's a figure that's set by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. It's based on the average cost of what is widely regarded as being the basics for a decent life. In 2022, this was set at £25,000 for a single adult. In Wales in 2022, women's average annual income was just over £22,000. Women on average in Wales are simply not earning enough to meet the minimum income standard. That's the very real cost of pay inequality, which does remain an issue. Women's pay is still lagging behind that of men. The latest pay data shows that in Wales, we have a full-time gender pay gap of 6.1%. This has actually gone up from 2021, where it was 4.9%. For all workers, when part-time workers, our average hourly pay is included as well, that increases to 11.3%. Part-time pay penalty and clear display there, I think. We also see that female employee jobs are more likely to be paid below the real living wage. 21% of female employee jobs are paid below the real living wage, compared to 15% of male employee jobs. 33% of part-time jobs are paid below the real living wage, compared to 11.5% of full-time jobs. In Wales, 39% of women work part-time, just 12% of men work part-time. And against that backdrop, sorry, I'm just having some issues with my screen here. Against that backdrop, we see the cost of a lot of essentials still going up. Can I just check? Can people pop in the chat? Can you still see the screen okay? I'm having a few tech issues this end. All good. Fab. So we see the cost of essentials still going up. Often we see in this space, obviously, a lot of discussion about fuel prices, food prices, etc. But we do also see the cost of childcare as a particular issue. If we look at the latest figures, the average cost of full-time childcare in Wales in 2022 was £246 a week. Women's average weekly pay, £424 per week. That is around 60%, just shy of 60% of women's pay going on childcare before any other costs are taken into account. Just going to stop sharing and reshare, guys, because I can't see my PowerPoint and I can't see my notes either. I've asked too much of my laptop today, I think, folks, unfortunately. Hang on one second. That. I'll be back in business, I hope. My screens are looking correct. Anyway, I'm sure somebody will tell me if there's another problem. Sorry about that, guys. So that's sort of where we're at in terms of cost pressures, the inequality that we see that are leaving women more vulnerable to the impacts of the cost of living crisis. What action do we think is needed to deal with this problem? Well, firstly, the gendered nature of the crisis absolutely needs to be considered at all levels of government when decisions are being taken about how we're going to support people with the pressures of the crisis. It's our view that proper intersectional equalities analysis has to be informing decision making, and that's important for UK government, Welsh government, and local government in what they're doing. We also echo recommendations that have been made by the UK Women's Budget Group to make sure that there's effective support in place through our social security system. We welcomed the announcements made back in the autumn that benefits would go up in line with inflation, but there is much more that needs to be done. A better approach for us would be to see the abolition of the benefit cap in the first place. Advances that are available to universal credit claimants would be far better delivered as non-repayable grants rather than loans, which puts people into a position where they're in debt before they've even sort of got started. And we echo calls made by a number of organisations for an end to no recourse to public funds. Related to the social security system, we are more than a little concerned about the focus on getting claimants who are in employment to increase their hours. That will disproportionately affect women. Women are far more likely to be claiming universal credit and to be in work. And they're often working few hours because of a lot of complex issues. A very blunt approach to that increased conditionality could have a disproportionate impact on women. We also would like to see many of the recommendations that were made back in the autumn by the Senate Economy, Trade and Rural Affairs Committee implemented ASAP. We certainly would like to see disaggregated cost of living data for Wales published regularly, so we can see actually the extent of what's going on and make sure that the action that is being taken is reaching those who are most in need. We'd also like to see an acceleration of the work to bring together means-tested benefit support schemes through a Welsh benefit system, a call that's been echoed just this week by the Finance Committee as well. We do think that there are some other measures that should be taken, particularly given the pressure on women's incomes. Would certainly like to see an acceleration of changes to roll out childcare support to more people. Welcome what's been done so far, but ideally we would like to see us going much further and more quickly in Wales. We saw the implementation of the Renting Homes Act just before Christmas. We would also like to see an acceleration around the commitment to publish a white paper on proposals on a system of fair rents. We know private rental sector tenants are being particularly hard hit by the effects of the cost of living crisis. And for women in that situation, they're obviously going to be dealing with the disproportionate impacts that we've shared today as well. And we do think there's a question about how we can ensure that access to cost of living advice and to support schemes are as easy as possible. Any barriers that we have in place removed, and so that people can go to a single source for information, advice, guidance to navigate what can be a very complex landscape of support schemes. So to conclude, from our perspective, it's important that we keep in mind that women, particularly women who are disabled, ethnic minority and racialized women, lone parents, are being hit harder by the cost of living crisis. That's rooted in the persistent inequality that we still see. And we need to do what we can to make sure that those groups are not left more vulnerable to falling into financial difficulty and poverty. So our response to the crisis at all levels needs to take account of women's lived experiences. In the short term, action to ensure that pressure is reduced on women's incomes and that the social security system is fit for purpose. But longer term, we need to get to grips with the inequality that is leaving more women more vulnerable to the impacts of this crisis in the first place. Stop sharing my screen there. Again, apologies for the tech issues today. And I shall hand over to Luke for his presentation, as I said, before we get into questions later on.
Thank you, Natasha, and sorry if my voice gives out halfway through. I've got the remnants of some kind of cold / I was out for the rugby on the weekend. It's still, as was Natasha, so I saw you there. But hello, my name's Luke. I'm the Assistant Director of Citizens Advice Cymru. You may know of Citizens Advice. We operate in 19 local offices right across Wales. We have a national helpline and assistance line. Through the Welsh Government, we help deliver Advice Link Cymru, which is a service to deliver advice and guidance to those in groups that particularly need it and perhaps historically haven't accessed it. So it's very much an agenda of widening the availability of advice and support. That's obviously difficult in the best of times, and the sad reality is we've not been in the best of times for quite a long time now. I think actually, if we were to take a step back and look at the period of the last few years, we could all identify lots of mini and big crises that have impacted our ways of working, our lives, the economy, but also the impacts that have then been felt, particularly on women throughout their lives. What I'm going to do now is talk about what we're seeing through citizens' advice. So talk you through some of the things that we're seeing through our service, some of the trends. Lots of the trends will be familiar, I'm sure of that, and reflect actually lots of the things that Natasha has spoken about. But hopefully it will give you a service delivery side of our work. And if I click slideshow, that should come up fantastic. So, as I said, our service is delivered online, through the phone, through face-to-face, through our 19 offices, and we see thousands upon thousands of people every year. Last year, single adult households made up 3/4 of the clients who came to Citizen Advice for household debt advice. Now, single people with children were disproportionately more likely to come to us for that kind of debt advice last year, and compared to other types of advice, and 91% of these are women. So if you think about some of the statistics that Natasha has shown, and also some of the statistics that Quaraiteg has highlighted over recent months, each of them have showed a disproportionate effect on women with children, and on single women. In our client data, so the people that come to Citizens Advice, 91% of those single people with children are women. And so it's very easy from that to see actually the effects of the cost of living crisis are having a disproportionate effect on that cohort of people. A word of warning, this is about people who come to Citizens Advice. There is a whole world of people who never come to Citizens Advice for a multitude of reasons, and will be accessing other support services. By sharing our data, what we're hoping to do is help move the conversation along and identify trends, but we don't pretend to have the entire picture. We're just one part of that picture. Similarly, it's worth saying disabled people and people with long-term health conditions are more likely to come for household bill debt advice compared to our general client base. That's a trend that has existed for a very long time in Citizens Advice. Our client base typically tends to be around half of all of our clients having a disability or long-term health condition. So what does this look like? So for that group, and more broadly, but actually what does this look like for women in the cost of living crisis, particularly single women and single women with children? Well, it looks like this. Last year, we saw people come to us for advice on debt and the pressures that they feel in the households. On fuel debts, we saw them almost double the number of clients for fuel debt advice than pre-pandemic, and the average debt rose from £1,114 to £1,419. Now you think, well, actually, that is a few £100s that's going to impact someone. It's important to put that in the context of this is debt. So this isn't just a rising of household costs. We're not talking about women who are completely able to meet household expenditure every month. What we're speaking about is people who are having mounting up energy debt that goes above and beyond some of the government support that is available. Council tax debt, it's really interesting with council tax debt in Wales because it's still the biggest debt overall last year in our figures. It remained quite high, and particularly for advice for those who are disabled, for women who are disabled and have a long-term health condition as well. But it's been competing with energy debt over the past year. So there were different points in the year, such as last March, where energy debt spiked in Wales to be the #1 top debt issue. Similarly, in the autumn to winter period, it spiked. But in local authority areas right across Wales, council tax debt and energy debt have competed with each other for the top debt issue. Our statistics in England actually show that it's way and above with energy debt, and that council tax debt has just kind of stayed level to where it was emerging back from the pandemic. What I read into that is that we've got two forms of debt right now in Wales that are putting lots of pressure on households: energy and fuel debt and council tax debt. And obviously, those costs continue to roll in because council tax continues to rise and energy costs continue to rise as well. We've also seen in rent arrears rising numbers, particularly amongst those social renters, people who are owing money on their rent. And in water and sewerage, this was interesting to me because particularly if you will have seen in the last few days rises in the cost of water being announced. We were seeing higher than average numbers seeking help last year, the highest since 2016. That's noteworthy. It hasn't got as much attention as the energy stuff for understandable reasons, but it is worth us thinking about it. So what does this look like? Well, we've been able to model what the cost of living support offered by the UK and the Welsh government looks like compared to the cost of living. And the picture is pretty much like this. So you can see on this chart with the dotted line rises up. That's the rise in the cost of living. Each of these bars represents a change by either the UK government or the Welsh government in support that has been given out. So you can see these purple bars being cost of living payments that have been given out throughout the past year. You can see the Wales Fuel Support Scheme that was given out last winter and also this winter. So that's this green bit on top of these bars here. And what you see is, and these are slightly crudely equalized throughout each month to give an impression as to what this support would have done in totality. Obviously, that's not always realistic for people's budgets, but it tells a picture. And the picture pretty much is that people were better off in Wales because of the decisions of the Welsh government this winter. Those on the lowest incomes and a wider group of around 400,000 households got access to the Wales Fuel Support Scheme worth £200, and it kept them more or less above float for a particular group of people. So that's the UK government support and the Welsh government support. That's where we are right now. And actually, if you are entitled to the Wales Fuel Support Scheme, you've got until the end of this month to apply within the current scheme before it closes. So if you are eligible, please do have a look at that, or if you need some support, certainly come to Citizens Advice and we'll try and point you in the right direction. But then it's what happens next. And that's where we are now. So you have a look at March 2023 on the bottom of that bar, and then April. So we don't have confirmation as to what's going to happen with the energy bill support scheme announced by the UK government. We don't have the full detail on it, but we suspect that it won't be universal. There won't be a sense of £400 for every household as it has been this winter. Government support generally will drop back, which includes those on the lowest incomes. We know that benefits will be uprated in April 2023. So that's this yellow bar that takes account of that uprating and what that will mean compared to the rising cost of living. But then we have this big and widening gap between where government support is going to drop back and rising living costs are going to continue to go up. And that's where we have a real concern and we have a real worry about what's going to happen. And for a few reasons, really. Natasha quite rightly pointed out about data and about the ability to understand what's going on in real time. We have started to share our real-time data as best as we can in order to basically help others and policymakers understand what's going on in kind of real time. So we have what we call a cost of living dashboard. There's a Citizens Advice one, which covers England and Wales and often a UK-wide picture. But we have a Wales-specific one where we try to drill down into what we're seeing. So we are seeing a rise in the numbers of people on negative budgets coming to us. So a negative budget is pretty much if you have no money left after essential costs. And, we will share these links, but actually make it quite clear on you, we've never seen a higher proportion of people who have negative budgets in Wales. We think this is probably going to be one of the big public policy frames in the coming months, and one of the things that we should look at. So just to drill down onto this for a little bit, because it's worth, there are some stories that are told in the data. So for all of our debt clients, we can see that those on a negative budget has increased. We can break that down slightly, and hopefully this is being seen on the screen. We need to break that down by gender and the data that's available to us. What you can see here is what appears to be, on the face of it, actually that a steeper rise in the number of men coming to us with negative budgets. What is kind of offsets that is that earlier statistic around the numbers of women and single women with children in particular coming to us for general debt advice. Now, I think, and we're doing some more digging on this, but actually this looks more like a general fluctuation in the numbers coming to us, whereas the broader picture on debt and on those clients that are coming to us is still disproportionately towards women. But it's worth saying this if you're going to go after this call and have a look on this data. It's interesting, but we don't think it tells us anything that we didn't already know pretty much. And then if we go as to household type, well, those on negative budgets, single person with children and single person, and we know those are disproportionately women, well, you can see actually those numbers, that's where those numbers come up. Interestingly, for couples with children in the October to December time, those coming to us on negative budget drop slightly. But we've seen this trend elsewhere as well in our data, which is when the UK government and Welsh government give direct payments to people, there is a corresponding fall in people who come to Citizens Advice for emergency support. We'd like for a bit more data on to be sure of those trends, but pretty much it's happened each time direct payments have gone to people in the past year. And then, you know, we can break this down by private, own their own home or social tenant. Actually, pretty much a story there is that though for people on a negative budget who have no money left after all essential costs, those lines are basically converging at a higher rate than they ever have before. And that's obviously a worry. As I mentioned earlier, those who are disabled or with a long-term health condition have traditionally and continue to be more represented in our work. Why am I talking through this? Well, it's important for us to know where we're going, but also I wanted to give kind of an overview of a line in this as to where we currently are. And given everything that we know, given the statistics that Natasha and I have talked about and the experience that women are facing within the cost of living crisis, and that lots of those households have children in, this is the data for the number of people who've been unable to top up their prepayment meters in the last year. Now, we will have heard a lot about prepayment meters in the media in the last few weeks. If you've been following the story, you will have heard a lot since last summer. This is a graph of all from 2016 to 2020. Now, if we were to, and that's, as you can see, running along the bottom of totals here. Now, if we were to add in 2021, and a lighter, you might not be able to see it, but hopefully you can, there's a lighter line that comes up just here, just to this dotted line. Then, when we add in 2022, we saw 10 times as many people last year who were unable to top up their prepayment meters than in the last 10 years combined. Now, that is a terrifying statistic in itself. And you add in, and then you bake in and think about the number of women and single women households with children put into this who can't afford to top up the prepayment meter. That means they are more likely to be cut off multiple times if they have a prepayment meter in any given year, but also more likely to be the ones that on the receiving end of energy companies' obsession with installing prepayment meters for debt collection measures. Now, in the past 2 days, we've seen quite a lot on this. So yesterday, one of the Lord Justices has confirmed to magistrates' courts that they should stop signing off warrants to forcibly install prepayment meters for the time being. Ofgem, the regulator, has finally come out and warned energy companies that he'll be investigating those practices. And energy companies have pretty much been shamed into stopping this practice. And I say shamed because our data, it was very clear last summer in the rise in those who were on prepayment coming to us because they couldn't top up a prepayment meter. Equally, there are data sets on that dashboard around energy costs and energy debts, which have corresponding lines. So that's people who, before they're put on a prepayment meter, but are struggling with energy costs generally. Now, that has existed for months. It's something that we have said, it's something that many, many organizations have said. The big change this week is that the Sunday Times, or the Times, sorry, did an investigation with British Gas that showed that people were being forcibly installed and illegally having prepayment meters forcibly installed. People were, in certain circumstances, they were break-ins by debt collection officers to install those prepayment meters. Now, the thing is, this isn't new to us. These are things that we have identified and pointed out to people, but it did take the Times doing a bigger expose on it to shame the energy companies into taking action. Why do I talk about this? Well, I think it's because it's more of a bit of a rallying call for those of us who are interested in the cost of living crisis and its impacts on women, but also impacts on people more broadly, is that we can have as much data and we can have as much of as an insight as to what is currently going on. That doesn't always mean that policymakers are going to listen to us. So we have to use every single opportunity that we possibly can. And I know I was on a committee with Natasha a few weeks ago with the finance committee, and I'm very confident that, in Wales in particular, we can tell truth to the Welsh government, and it will be heard in a way that I hope is listened to, but it will certainly be heard even if there can't be an immediate response. That always isn't the case elsewhere, but that isn't the case when we're talking about these big, large companies who are chasing down debts from vulnerable people. And so it's a reminder, really, another sobering reminder that we've all got a lot of work to do to help people. That has been kind of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully you will have seen some of the data and impacts on women through our data. I will end it there, and I'm sure we can go to questions. So back over to Natasha.
Thank you. That was really insightful. And I haven't dug into the dashboard before. I'm sure me and the team will certainly be doing that. Can't quite get over that shooting up of the prepayment debt situation. That's incredibly sobering. At this point, I will ask my colleague Thomas to join us, who has been monitoring chat and Q&A, who is going to pop questions to myself and Luke, and hopefully we'll be able to do our best to answer as many of them as we can.
Lovely. Well, we've had a few questions in so far, but please, if you have got any more, just ask them and I'll give them to Tash and Luke. So a question from Jess. She's had to leave, unfortunately, but she's kind of asked a relatively specific question around what work needs to be done cross-government to ensure that, the third sector, but also government, Welsh government, are working together to try and get these things changed. Like, what action needs to be taken to tackle some of these issues that we've been speaking about this afternoon.
Yeah, good question. Difficult question. I suppose, I think, did I mention, I've mentioned this in answer to a question recently in another session, I'm sure, but I think for me, I remain very concerned that we don't have a proper cross-government strategy or action plan around poverty. For me, it feels like a bit of a gap. I know that we talk about, or we certainly hear it talked about, that poverty is a cross-cutting theme. Good. I think it's very difficult, certainly external to government, to really understand what is contributing to those goals, what the goals are, and how much progress we're making without that strategy in place. What is there to keep departments focused, delivery departments focused, ministers focused, when there's an awful lot, going on in the world, and what's there to support scrutiny? How are we able to ask the right questions if we don't really fully understand what that sort of cross-governmental strategy is? So that being said, if there's a cross-government strategy and it's not what the paper is written on, then that doesn't help. But a decent, focused cross-governmental strategy for me would be really, really important. I think particularly given, actually, I was quite struck, actually, Luke, by the sort of that big gap that is coming with this sort of support specifically for the cost of living crisis. But we know that cost of living crisis is exacerbating underlying issues of poverty as well. So I feel like across both of those things, there's a lack of that kind of strategic coordination, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's the immediate, which is if you were a government and you want to stop paying emergency funds to people because they can't meet their housing costs or other costs that are coming in, you've got to look at it and think, well, what is that balance between more income versus less expenditure in any household? That's the key dynamic. And so if you're the Welsh government or UK government, actually, you look at it and you go, if I don't want to keep paying these emergency payments, how do I bring those costs down for people, lower their expenditure? The way you would do that, I think, in housing costs and in energy costs is on a huge, and it would have to be huge to be effective, insulation programme, energy efficiency programme in Welsh homes. Welsh housing and UK more broadly have some of the worst energy efficient homes in the whole of Europe. This has been a long-term infrastructure issue. Climate change has certainly sped up the need for better infrastructure. But that would be an answer. But that's at best with the best will in the world. If that program were to start today or at a mass scale, a few thousand homes might be insulated and up to standards by winter. But you would still need support for those on those who are most vulnerable and those who are unable to afford. And that would be a multi-billion-pound project, in all honesty. So you're left with a case of, well, if you can't do that, what else can you do? So you reduce costs on people's day-to-days. Now, the Welsh government have attempted to do that by things like free school meals, reducing uniform costs, other areas where it's tried to bring costs down for people, which is a noble aim. But again, fundamentally, the core problem is you've got cold, leaky homes that are leaking up to £400 worth of energy a year. So people are using more energy to heat their homes. And so to fill up that gap, or not using that energy at all, but to fill up that gap, you have to put in emergency payments. And so I think this is the big structural issue, which is we can talk about what we need to do now and into winter. And I think the Welsh Government budget currently doesn't include the Wales Fuel Support Scheme for the next year. That's a huge £90 million scheme. I don't scoff at that, actually. It was a big investment. And in the current budget, that's equivalent to the headline youth jobs guarantee in the budget. It is a huge ask of the government. Now, you can remove the scheme, but the need is still going to be there. And I think what we will see in the coming months, and I hope that others will join us, is highlighting, based on the data that we have, how that need is going to be there next winter, particularly for those on low income, given the withdrawal of UK government support and the withdrawal of some Welsh government support. So we have the emergency stage, and then we have the stage of, okay, how do we get out of emergency? And what I'd like to see in terms of a cross-government coordination is more thought on how do we break the cycle of crisis? Because COVID was a crisis that our public services had kind of thrust upon it, that was certainly not of anyone's fault here. It was something that happened in nature and has affected us profoundly. There are other crises that have happened in the last few years that are perfectly within the power of politicians and our institutions to help frame and shape. And so I think that's where we need to be.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point around sort of the cycle of crisis. And I think sort of what I'd add to that, which is something I've said a few times as we've been sort of prepping State of the Nation, is that each of those crises is impacting the same groups again and again and again, because we're leaving inequality at the level that it's at. We're not making significant progress in closing those gaps. And so we will find ourselves in another crisis. That's almost certainly going to be the case. And as it stands, we're going to see the same groups left more vulnerable again, which is a real concern.
Yeah, thank you both. There's a question here from Megan, possibly one more for you, Luke, about whether the cost of living payments that were made had a differential impact on those in receipt of universal credit and those on legacy benefits.
The short answer is it will have helped, but actually it will have helped in the same way as the graph that I showed where those payments meet the line of a rising cost of living. So it will have helped, but I've no doubt that actually for those on UC or legacy benefits, an element of debt will have still been accrued over that time and over the last few months. People who are on UC are most likely to be in the group that are on negative budgets based on the client data that came to us last year. And I think there's something there really around, we know that the level of income is not enough to meet the level of outgoings in those households in particular. And that is, that's particularly worrying. But there's an action that we can get Welsh Government to take, hopefully, which is those on UC, and if there were issues related to COVID, have been able to access the discretionary assistance fund up to 5 times a year with shorter waiting periods up until now. We really want to see the Welsh Government extend that for at least another year, because those flexibilities have helped people stay above water in the past year. But yeah, as you can imagine, and as you'll know from your work, Megan, there's lots of impacts of the cost of living crisis on those who are on UC or on legacy benefits, just as generally our client data is disproportionately those with a disability or with a long-term health condition. So we'll be keeping a close eye on it. And if you spot any trends, please do let us know.
I think I would just add sort of, it's not directly related to that question, but certainly to the point about universal credit. And I'm sure there are colleagues on the webinar who've heard, have been part of the conversations that I'm going to reference, but it's something that came up when we gave evidence as well. I think as well, it was sort of that universal credit as the kind of thing that opens the door to a lot of other support, and perhaps a lack of understanding that it is in fact an in-work benefit as well as an out-of-work benefit. I don't doubt there will be people out there, and it's likely that women will make up a sizable proportion of them, given we know that women tend to be working fewer hours and on lower pay, might never have thought that universal credit was something that they should apply for. They might not be entitled to a huge amount via it, but they are missing out on a huge swathe of support because they're not on that original benefit that then passports you onto everything else. And, you know, I don't know that in some of the stuff that's been out in sort of the Claim What's Yours campaign, it's absolutely good to be making sure that people claim everything that they're entitled to, but has that been reaching the right people? Has that been reaching the people who really need to sort of, who perhaps who don't understand everything that they're entitled to, that I'm not necessarily as clear on at the moment.
And if I can just add to that, I think it is a genuine concern, isn't it? I completely agree with you. We do have a sense of, and we have to be careful and check ourselves as to how we talk about the cost of living crisis and how people hear it, because I've had conversations where, for example, with people who say, well, I'm not on any benefits, so I can't access discretionary assistance payments, which for their case was true, and it is an element of truth. But that doesn't mean that they can't access other support, or that there is another support they can be signposted onto. But it's more often than not, you know, they will see the big shiny payment, and there's a risk with this with the Wales Fuel Support Scheme as well. Someone will look at the eligibility criteria and go, there's nothing there for me. Whereas actually, it just takes a bit more digging, because it's not the big shiny one that is mentioned in all of the Welsh Government advertising. So I think that's a challenge for us, certainly at Citizen Advice, and a challenge more broadly about how we're getting the right advice to people.
So I can see that no more questions have come in just yet, but a question kind of from me, from some of what you were saying, Luke, and I know some of the work that's been done by Chwarae over the years. We can see obviously that those single parent households are the ones who are predominantly with the negative budgets, but people still need to make ends meet. So obviously levels of debt are probably increasing. I think that's probably an educated guess in my part. Do we know where people are getting their money from? Who are they in debt to? And kind of what risks and challenges are there attached to that? Because obviously certain support schemes from government and so on and so forth are only eligible in certain areas with who you have got debt with, be it credit cards, store cards, so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So what we're not seeing in our current data is a big spike in consumer debt, which we did expect that we would. So on things like credit cards, store cards, we've not seen that come through just yet. But then that's not surprising in itself, because that would take some time before you're unable to make those payments, those repayments, versus the cost of living. So we do kind of expect that to increase over the coming months. So that would, on consumer debt in itself, that will be a rise in place. What we kind of know anecdotally, and through work with our partners through the Single Advice Fund, is that more people are going to credit unions, and so that is and seeking support generally there, which is which is both a good in terms of getting a better form of credit, and also a worrying considering that people are needing to make ends meet. The one that really worries me is, this is coming through our service, I guess. It is partly a consumer debt, but buy now, pay later across quite a few websites. Now, we saw the explosion of buy now, pay later on websites like ASOS for fashion. That's been coming for years. But now we're seeing buy now, pay later for supermarkets. And for me, that idea that it's buy now, pay later, and then the next month actually you can't pay later, and then suddenly people are getting into crisis over food. That's the real worry, I think, for me. And that's where we see a corresponding rise with people coming to us for food and fuel vouchers. So we're part of a huge network across Wales of food banks and organisations that refer in for food vouchers, and those numbers have increased alongside energy debts in the past year. So I think in terms of where people are going for it, I think it's a mixture. They're coming to us predominantly because they don't know where to go, and it was Martin Lewis that said back last year, the tools that Money Saving Expert has to help people have diminished. There's not many tools left. But for our frontline advisors, the toolbox is looking pretty bare as well. And so what we end up doing when people are in that place is seeing how you can cancel those debts and write them all off. But the core thing, I was asked about this in the Senate committee the other day about, is a big debt write-off the answer to all of the problems here? All of our evidence directly with those affected and people that we've helped shows us that people want to pay their bills, they want to pay their debts. What they lack is a fair and sustainable way of doing it. And that's the pushback that we give to government quite regularly, is that this isn't a case of people not wanting to pay any of their debts and wanting it all to go away and someone to wave a magic wand. This is people who can't pay, and they want to be able to, but you're just not letting them in a way that's fair and sustainable. So yeah, I think more on consumer debt to come though this year, if I could bet on anything.
Yeah, I think it's a real risk, and sort of looking at some sort of historical data around the gender aspects. We know that women are more likely to be using high cost credit to cover the cost of essentials compared to men. We know that high cost credit is more likely to be used for essentials by parents and those without children, by those with long-term health conditions, with minority backgrounds. It's all those same groups again. And that's the key thing is I think that the fact that is being used for essential items. And, that's often drawing on data that existed before the cost of living crisis hit, when the cost of essentials was so far outstripping people's incomes. So that's the worry, is especially again in the context of that drop off of support potentially come April time, and sort of how people's budgets then get further squeezed and they feel that they've got nowhere else to turn. And if they're not as aware of some of the existing support that is available, perhaps they're more likely to turn to those kind of sources of income of finance before they perhaps turn to better sources of of emergency support, would be my concern as well. We are fast approaching our 2 o'clock finish, so I might just throw one question in, if I may. I was struck by what you said, Luke, about sort of making sure that policymakers are listening to the evidence. And obviously there's a role here for both the Welsh Government and the UK Government. We've got the spring budget statement not far around the corner. What do we, as third sector organisations that are working on the front line that have got these insights, what do you think we should be doing to try and highlight what needs to change? What are the key things that we need to be shouting about to ensure that perhaps that big cliff edge perhaps isn't as severe as it looks like it might be at the moment?
Okay, so there are a few things with the lack of a medium to long-term plan that is about improving energy efficiency and reducing costs generally on household costs to correspond with rising energy prices. I think we're still looking at direct payments as emergency support for those who are struggling the most. I think we have to keep that on the agenda for both the UK and the Welsh Government. In terms of the spring statement, though, I think basically what we need is a big chunk of money from the UK Government to let the Welsh Government have some wriggle room in all the things it needs to do. it just feels to me, and I'll continue doing it, but it does feel really difficult to go into meetings and argue for something about next winter, when right now we see industrial action in the health service, teachers going out on strike, rail workers going on strike as well, quite rightly, over cost of living issues that they are facing in their own lives. And because fundamentally, the more income you have, the more likely you are to be better off in the cost of living crisis. And so I kind of place it in that space, which is there are very obvious things both governments need to do. Right now in Wales, I think it would probably help a little bit in the immediate term, and then looking towards winter is a bit more money in the Welsh Government's budget and flexibility, so that it can help people who are still in a crisis setting right now. And then beyond that, as I've said, we need a long-term plan. Just to pick up on your point around kind of a poverty action plan, though, is that it really depresses me that I remember about 10, 15 years ago, all of the conversation was around, we can end child poverty within a generation. We don't have that conversation anymore. We can't have that conversation anymore. It is now, how many kids are going to grow up in poverty in Wales, and what can we do? What can we really do to alleviate some of the aspects of that? I'd love us to be able to have a conversation about where we invest our money. It to be a decision as, let's throw a load of money into early years learning and childcare in order to give people the best start, young people the best start in lives. There are a number of reasons why that's good, but we just feel to be in a constant crisis. And so we're not there yet. But if we keep pushing, I think that we will get there. It's just going to be a long slog from you.
Yeah, that's really great insights. And yeah, I agree with you. I've just written down, have we given up on tackling poverty, like actually tackling poverty? I think you're right. The discourse needs to come back to far more ambitious goals than perhaps we're at the moment. I will wrap us up. Thank you so much for joining us today, Luke. Really useful insights, and I'm sure I won't be the only person digging into that data dashboard going forward. A thanks to my team as well, Thomas and the rest of the team, for helping to organise today and keep everything running smoothly. And apologies again for my slight tech issue. I scrolled on the mouse and then my laptop had a freak out. I have no idea what that was about. Thomas has popped a link in the chat to our quality and diversity monitoring forms. If you are able to fill those out, it's much appreciated. We do like to keep an eye on who it is we're engaging with and making sure that we're reaching out to as many of our stakeholders and colleagues and sister and brother organisations as possible. We have got another event this week. Brad, as State of the Nation, will be running an introduction to gender budgeting on Thursday, which will involve a bit of an interactive session run by a couple of my colleagues as well. You can book onto that via links on our website on our events page. So yeah, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time over lunchtime. Some sobering information, I know, in both those presentations, but I think it just goes to show there's still a job to be done to keep chatting about these issues and making sure that policymakers are listening to us. Thanks very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.